On a freezing winter night, an old woman opened her door to find two shivering puppies outside. With a kind heart, she took them in, wrapping them in blankets, never imagining what was about to unfold. By morning, her quiet cabin in the woods was surrounded. Police cars flashing lights, officers shouting commands. The villagers whispered, "Why had the police come? What had those dogs brought with them?" The truth would leave an entire town shocked, and her life changed forever. Stay with us until the end, because you won't believe what really happened inside that cabin. Before we start, hit like, share, and subscribe. And drop in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The old woman's name was Margaret, and for years, her life had followed the same slow, silent rhythm. She lived alone in a small wooden house at the edge of town, surrounded by tall pine trees and long stretches of untouched snow. Winter stayed longer here than anywhere else, wrapping everything in white and muting the world outside. Most days, the only sounds she heard were the wind brushing against the walls and the ticking clock in her living room. Margaret woke up before sunrise every morning, not because she had to, but because her body was used to it. She would make a simple breakfast, usually tea and dry toast, then sit near the window and watch the snow fall. Sometimes she spoke out loud, not to anyone in particular, just to fill the silence. Her husband had passed away many years ago, and her children lived far away, busy with lives of their own. Phone calls were rare. Visits were even rarer. Despite the loneliness, Margaret was kind. Neighbors knew her as the woman who waved from her porch and baked extra bread, just in case someone needed it. She never asked for much. In fact, she believed that if you stayed quiet and didn't bother the world might leave you alone in return. That night, the storm was worse than usual. Snow piled up against her windows, and the cold slipped through even the thick wooden walls. Margaret added another log to the fireplace and wrapped herself tighter in her old wool shawl. She remembered thinking how quiet everything felt. Too quiet. No cars. No footsteps. Just the storm. She had no idea that this calm was about to break. At that moment, Margaret was simply an old woman trying to get through another cold night. She didn't know that before the sun rose, her quiet life would be pulled into something dangerous and unexpected. And she certainly didn't know that one small act of kindness would soon place her at the center of a situation that would bring police cars, flashing lights, and fear to her doorstep. For now, though, she sat alone, unaware that her life was about to change forever. As the night grew deeper, the storm outside Margaret's house became louder and more unforgiving. The wind howled through the trees, bending their frozen branches until they creaked like they might snap at any moment. Snow slammed against the windows in thick waves, as if someone was throwing handfuls of ice from the darkness. Margaret had lived through many winters, but something about this one felt different, harsher, angrier. She moved slowly across the room, checking the locks on the door and windows, a habit she had picked up after years of living alone. Everything was secure, yet unease settled in her chest. The power flickered once, then again, causing the lights to dim. Margaret paused, holding her breath, listening. When the lights steadied, she let out a quiet sigh and returned to her chair near the fire. Outside, the world was nearly invisible. The road leading to her house had disappeared under layers of snow, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. If something happened tonight, no one would know. That thought made her pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She tried to distract herself by knitting, but her fingers trembled slightly, and she dropped the needles twice. Then she heard something that didn't belong to the storm. At first, it was faint, almost lost beneath the wind. Margaret tilted her head, straining to listen. There it was again, a sound low and broken, like a cry being swallowed by the cold. She stood up slowly, her heart beginning to race. It could have been the wind, she told herself, or an animal passing by. But the sound came again. This time, it was clearer. A weak whimper. Margaret walked toward the front door, each step heavier than the last. Her mind filled with questions and warnings. It was dangerous to open the door at this hour. Dangerous to invite trouble in during a storm like this. She placed her hand on the door handle, but didn't turn it yet. Another whimper cut through the air, closer now. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered her husband's voice, long gone, telling her that ignoring someone in need was worse than any risk. With a shaky breath, she reached for the lock. Whatever was outside had survived the storm long enough to reach her door. And something told her that once she opened it, there would be no turning back. When Margaret finally opened the door, the cold rushed in so sharply it stole her breath. Snow swirled into the hallway, landing on the old wooden floor. For a brief second, she saw nothing but white. Then her eyes lowered, and her heart dropped. Two dogs stood on her porch. They were large, their bodies thin and stiff from the cold. Snow clung to their fur, and their legs trembled as they tried to stay upright. One of them had a small cut above its eye, frozen red against dark fur. The other leaned slightly to one side, exhausted, as if it had used the last of its strength just to reach this door. They didn't bark. They didn't growl. They simply looked up at her. Their eyes weren't wild like stray animals she had seen before. They were alert, focused, almost trained. One dog sat down slowly, despite the pain in its legs, while the other stayed standing, positioning itself slightly in front, as if guarding the first. Margaret noticed this without fully understanding why it felt so strange. "Oh my," she whispered. The dogs let out soft, weak whines, their breath coming out in short clouds. Their paws were cracked and bleeding from the ice, and their ribs were visible beneath their soaked fur. These weren't dogs that had been wandering for a few hours. They had been running for a long time. Margaret's instincts told her to be careful. Two large dogs in the middle of the night could be dangerous. Her hand tightened on the doorframe, and for a moment, she considered closing the door and calling for help in the morning. But then one of the dogs lowered its head and slowly lay down, as if surrendering. That single movement broke her. She had seen that posture before, not in animals, but in people. It was the posture of someone who had nothing left to give, someone who wasn't asking for comfort anymore, only survival. The dogs didn't try to step inside. They waited. Snow continued to fall onto their backs, melting into their fur. Their ears twitched at every sound. Their bodies tensed despite the exhaustion. These dogs were afraid, but not of her. They were afraid of something else. Margaret felt her chest tighten. "I don't know where you came from," she said softly, her voice shaking. "But you won't survive out here." She stepped back and opened the door wider. The dogs hesitated for a split second, then carefully crossed the threshold, one after the other. They didn't rush. They didn't sniff around wildly. They walked in like they had been taught to respect a home. As the door closed behind them, Margaret didn't realize it yet, but she had just welcomed more than two freezing dogs inside. She had unknowingly stepped into a story far bigger than her quiet life. Margaret stood still after closing the door, her back resting against the cold wood. Her heart was beating faster than she liked to admit. The dogs remained near the entrance, silent and cautious, as if waiting for permission to exist in the space. Steam rose gently from their wet fur, and the smell of snow and cold filled the room. For a moment, doubt crept in. She was old. She lived alone. These were large, unfamiliar dogs, and she had no idea what they were capable of. Every sensible thought told her this was a mistake. If something went wrong, there would be no one to hear her call for help. The storm outside had already erased the road. She was completely on her own. Margaret glanced at the phone on the wall. She could still call the authorities. She could explain that two dogs had shown up during the storm and let them handle it in the morning. That would be the responsible thing to do. That would keep her safe. But when she looked back at the dogs, something stopped her. They hadn't moved from the door. One sat upright despite shaking legs, eyes fixed forward. The other laid down again, head resting on its paws, chest rising and falling slowly. Neither showed signs of aggression. Instead, they looked disciplined, controlled, as if they were holding themselves back out of habit. Margaret's mind drifted to memories she hadn't touched in years. Her husband, standing in uniform by the door. The way he used to carry himself, alert even at rest. The same quiet readiness she now saw in these dogs. She swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. "I won't leave you out there," she said quietly, more to herself than to them. She walked toward the fireplace and grabbed an old blanket from the chair. Slowly, carefully, she laid it on the floor a few feet away from the fire. The dogs watched her every move, ears twitching, bodies tense but respectful. "It's warm here," she added softly. That was all it took. The dog closest to her stepped forward first, limping slightly, and settled onto the blanket. The second followed, positioning itself just close enough to touch. Margaret noticed how they stayed aware of each other, never fully relaxing. As she added another log to the fire, she felt a strange mix of comfort and fear. She had made her choice. She didn't know it yet, but this simple act, letting them stay, had already set things in motion. By morning, this decision would bring consequences she never imagined, and there would be no way to undo it. Margaret moved quietly around the room, careful not to startle the dogs. She filled a bowl with water and placed it near the blanket, then searched her small kitchen for anything they might eat. All she could find was leftover chicken soup and a few slices of bread. It wasn't much, but it was warm. When she set the bowl down, the dogs didn't rush forward. They waited. Only after Margaret stepped back did the larger one lower its head and begin to drink slowly, pausing every few seconds as if listening for danger. The second dog followed, taking small, careful sips. Their restraint unsettled her more than aggression would have. These dogs had manners, training, control. She watched as the heat from the fire slowly brought color back into their frozen paws. Their shaking eased, though neither fully relaxed. One dog kept its head lifted, eyes scanning the room, while the other lay down but flinched every time the wind slammed against the house. Margaret sat in her chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. "You're safe here," she said softly. At the sound of her voice, one dog turned its head toward her. Its eyes locked onto hers, not with fear, but with something deeper. Awareness. Almost recognition. The dog didn't blink. It simply watched her, breathing steady, ears slightly forward. Minutes passed. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the house, a fragile calm settled in. Margaret noticed scars beneath the dog's fur. Old ones. Not from fighting animals, but from something sharper. Something human-made. When a loud crack of thunder echoed nearby, both dogs reacted instantly. One jumped to its feet, body stiff, teeth clenched, while the other pressed closer to the fireplace, trembling. It wasn't panic, it was conditioning. The kind that comes from chaos repeated too many times. Margaret's chest tightened. "You've been through a lot," she whispered. She reached for her knitting again, trying to act normal, but her eyes never left them. The dogs eventually lay down side by side, backs touching, forming a silent barrier between the door and the rest of the house. Even exhausted, they positioned themselves to protect. That's when Margaret understood something wasn't right. These dogs weren't lost pets. They weren't strays. They were waiting for something, or someone. As the fire crackled and the storm raged on, Margaret felt a creeping sense of dread. Whatever past these dogs carried had followed them to her door. And deep down, she knew this night was only the beginning. By morning, the warmth she offered them would be repaid in a way she could never have prepared for. Each time she drifted off, a small sound would pull her back awake. The wind, the fire settling, the quiet movement of paws against the floor. Every time she opened her eyes, the dogs were alert. One always remained awake, sitting upright with its back straight, ears angled toward the windows. When that one finally rested its head, the other would rise, taking its place without a sound. They were rotating watch. That realization sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with the cold. Near dawn, she slowly pushed herself out of bed and peered into the living room. The fire had burned low, but the dogs were still exactly where she had left them. As she stepped closer, one of them stood immediately, not aggressively, but ready. Its body was calm, controlled, as if waiting for a command that never came. "It's just me," she whispered. The dog didn't relax. It simply observed. Margaret shuffled toward the kitchen and accidentally dropped a spoon. The sharp clang echoed through the house. In an instant, both dogs reacted. One moved toward the door, positioning its body sideways, blocking it. The other stepped forward, muscles tense, eyes locked on the source of the sound. Then just as quickly, they stopped. No barking. No panic. Just silence. Margaret felt her heart pound. She had owned dogs years ago. She knew fear, excitement, curiosity. This was none of those. This was training. The kind that teaches restraint first and reaction second. As the morning light slowly crept through the windows, Margaret noticed more details. The dogs responded to hand movements, even small ones. When she raised her palm, without thinking, one of them immediately sat. When she lowered it, the dog stayed frozen, waiting for release. Her mouth went dry. "Who taught you that?" she murmured. The dogs didn't respond, but their eyes never left her. Not in a threatening way, in a focused way, as if they were assessing, constantly calculating. Margaret suddenly felt very small in her own home. These dogs had discipline carved into them, not learned on the streets, not from survival alone. This kind of behavior came from uniforms, commands, and long days of conditioning. She moved toward the window and peeked outside. The storm had passed, leaving the world eerily quiet. Snow covered everything, undisturbed except for 2 sets of paw prints leading straight to her door. No tracks leading away. Whatever these dogs were running from, they had meant to stop here. And as Margaret turned back to face them, a heavy truth settled in her chest. Letting them in hadn't ended their story. It had only paused it. As the night slowly gave way to early morning, the house remained unnaturally quiet. The storm had finally moved on, leaving behind a heavy silence that pressed against the walls. Margaret sat in her chair, wrapped in her shawl, watching the dogs from across the room. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, but she didn't trust herself to sleep. Neither did the dogs. They had settled into a pattern that never broke. One stayed awake while the other rested, their positions carefully chosen. They always kept the front door in sight. Even when their eyes closed, their ears twitched at the slightest sound, their bodies ready to move. At one point, the wind knocked a branch against the roof. Both dogs lifted their heads at the exact same moment. They didn't bark. They didn't growl. They simply listened, holding perfectly still until the sound passed. Only then did one of them lower its head again. Margaret's unease grew with every passing hour. She rose quietly and poured herself another cup of tea, her hands shaking just enough to spill a drop on the counter. The dogs noticed immediately. One turned its head toward her, eyes sharp, but relaxed again when she didn't show fear. "You don't miss anything," she whispered. The dogs stayed close to the warmth of the fire, but never fully rested. Their breathing was light, controlled. This wasn't exhaustion alone. It was vigilance. The kind that comes from nights spent in danger, waiting for something bad to happen. As dawn crept closer, a faint blue light filled the room. Margaret noticed scratches along one dog's side and a deeper wound near the other shoulder, poorly hidden beneath fur. They had been hurt recently, not by animals, by something far worse. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Whatever these dogs had escaped from, it hadn't been simple. And whatever had chased them had power, resources, and time. When the clock finally ticked past 6 in the morning, Margaret stood near the window and looked out at the empty street. Snow-covered and silent, peaceful, at least on the surface. Behind her, the dogs rose to their feet in unison. Not afraid, not aggressive, waiting. Margaret didn't know why, but in that moment, she was certain of one thing. This night had not ended. It had only been holding its breath. The first sound wasn't loud. It was distant, faint, almost mistaken for the wind. Margaret stood by the window, staring at the snow-covered street. When she heard it, a low, rising wail cutting through the silence. She frowned, leaning closer to the glass. A moment later, the sound came again. This time, clearer. Sirens. Her heart skipped. No one ever came down this road, especially not this early. As the sound grew louder, the dogs reacted instantly. Both moved to the center of the room, bodies tense, ears forward, eyes sharp. One stepped directly in front of Margaret without touching her, blocking her path to the door. "It's all right," she whispered, though she didn't believe it herself. Red and blue lights flashed across the walls, washing the room in color. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She pulled the curtain back just enough to look outside, and froze. Police cars lined the street. Not one, not two, several. Officers stepped out slowly, hands near their belts, scanning the house like it was a threat. One of them spoke into a radio. Another pointed toward her front door. Margaret's knees weakened. "Oh, dear God," she murmured. Behind her, one of the dogs let out a low sound. Not a growl, not a bark. A warning. The other moved closer to the door, standing tall, positioning itself between the entrance and the rest of the house. Their behavior was no longer subtle. This was familiar to them. The knocking came suddenly, hard, commanding. "Police," a voice called out. "Ma'am, we need you to open the door." Margaret's hands shook as she reached for a shawl. Her mind raced. Had she done something wrong? Was helping two freezing animals now a crime? She glanced at the dogs, hoping for some sign of reassurance. Instead, they stood ready, not to attack, but to protect. The knocking came again, louder this time. "Ma'am, please step away from the door." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. She took a slow step back, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. Outside, officers shifted positions, boots crunching against the snow. This wasn't a welfare check. This wasn't routine. Whatever those dogs were connected to had finally caught up to them. And now, Margaret was standing right in the middle of it. Margaret stood frozen in the middle of her living room, the sound of sirens still echoing in her ears. Outside, boots crunched through the snow as officers moved into position. She could see their shadows passing across the frosted windows, slow and deliberate. This wasn't panic. It was control. The dog sensed it too. One pressed closer to her side, close enough that she could feel its warmth through her coat. The other remained near the door, body angled, head lifted, eyes locked forward. Every muscle was tense, but restrained. They weren't reacting like cornered animals. They were reacting like trained units awaiting instruction. "Ma'am," the voice outside called again, calmer now but firm. "Please open the door and step outside with your hands visible." Margaret swallowed hard. "I'm just an old woman," she whispered to no one in particular. "I don't understand." She took a hesitant step toward the door. Instantly, the dog near the entrance shifted, placing itself directly between her and the handle. Not aggressive, protective, as if it believed danger waited on the other side. "It's all right," she said softly, placing a trembling hand on its shoulder. The dog didn't move. Another officer appeared at the window, peering inside. His eyes widened when he spotted the dogs. He spoke urgently into his radio, his voice sharp and fast. Margaret caught only fragments. Confirmed 2 of them inside the residence. Her heart sank. So it was about the dogs. More officers joined the first group, spreading out around the house. Some crouched behind their vehicles. Others stood still, watching. The street that had been silent an hour ago now felt like a scene from a nightmare. Margaret backed away from the door, tears streaming down her face. "I was just trying to help," she said aloud, her voice breaking. They were freezing. Behind her, the dogs remained steady. No barking. No panic. One slowly sat, the other stayed standing. Calm. Focused. Ready. The knocking stopped. For a moment, everything went quiet again. Then a new voice came through a loudspeaker. "Ma'am, we know the dogs are inside. Please remain calm. No one is here to hurt you." Margaret closed her eyes. She realized then that whatever she had brought into her home wasn't just trouble. It was important, serious, dangerous enough to bring this many officers to her door before sunrise. When she opened her eyes, she looked down at the dogs. "You must be very special," she whispered. Outside, the officers waited. Inside, 2 silent guardians stood their ground. And Margaret knew the next few minutes would change everything. The tension outside the house thickened as a senior officer stepped forward, lifting a hand to signal the others to hold their positions. He spoke quietly into his radio, then raised his voice so Margaret could hear him clearly through the door. "Ma'am, we believe the dogs inside your house are missing police K9S. Margaret's breath caught. Police dogs? She looked down at them again, really looked this time. The way they held themselves. The calm focus. The discipline that never broke, even now. Pieces that hadn't made sense before suddenly clicked together. "I didn't steal them," she called back, panic rising in her voice. "They came to my door. They were freezing. I only wanted to help." "We understand," the officer replied. "But these dogs disappeared after a major operation last night. They are highly trained and considered part of an active investigation." Inside, one of the dogs shifted at the sound of the officer's voice. Its ears twitched and its eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but recognition. The other dog let out a low breath, steady and controlled, as if bracing for what came next. Margaret felt her knees weaken and lowered herself into a chair. An operation. That explained the injuries, the scars, the behavior during the night. These dogs hadn't been abandoned. They had escaped. Outside, the officer continued, his tone measured. Those dogs were involved in tracking dangerous suspects. When the situation turned violent, they broke formation and ran. Margaret's heart sank. "They didn't run to hide," she whispered, looking at them. "They ran to survive." The dogs remained silent, but one turned its head toward her, eyes softening just slightly. Not fear, not guilt, something closer to relief. Another officer approached the senior one and spoke under his breath. Margaret couldn't hear the words, but she saw the reaction. A slow nod, followed by a long exhale. The officer lifted his head again. "Ma'am, we believe the dogs left the scene on their own. That usually means one thing." "What?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "They sensed something was wrong, a threat they weren't trained to face." Silence filled the space between them. Margaret realized then that these dogs weren't criminals. They weren't dangerous animals on the run. They were heroes who had made a decision. And now, surrounded by police, standing between duty and instinct, they were waiting to see what the humans would do next. The senior officer stepped a little closer to the door, his voice lowering, losing its sharp edge. What came next didn't sound like an order. It sounded like an explanation. "The operation went wrong," he said, louder than expected. Gunfire. Explosions. Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. "These dogs were trained for control," he continued. "But even the best training has limits. When things spiral, instinct takes over." Inside the house, one of the dogs flinched slightly at the word explosions. It was subtle, just a tightening of the jaw, a shift of weight, but Margaret noticed. She had seen that reaction before. In people. In her husband, after he came home from difficult calls and sat in silence for hours. They weren't disobeying, the officer added. They were protecting themselves and each other. Margaret looked at the two dogs standing side by side. Their closeness made sense now. The way they never separated. The way they watched in turns. They weren't just partners by training. They were bonded by trauma. Another officer spoke quietly from behind the cars. "One of the suspects is still missing." That sentence hit Margaret like ice water. So that was it. These dogs hadn't just run from chaos. They had run from unfinished danger. From something that could still be out there, still moving, still hunting. Margaret felt a wave of fear, but also understanding. "You're scared they're unpredictable now," she said softly, more a statement than a question. There was a pause outside. "Yes," the officer finally admitted. "Dogs who break from command during an active case are usually removed from duty. Sometimes permanently." Margaret's chest tightened. She looked down at the dogs again. At the scars. The injuries. The exhaustion carved into their posture. Nothing about them felt reckless. They felt wounded. Overloaded. Like soldiers who had been pushed too far. "They didn't run because they were dangerous," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "They ran because they were overwhelmed." Neither dog moved, but one slowly lowered its head, resting it against the other's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it said everything. Outside, the officers exchanged glances. This wasn't part of protocol. There were no manuals for moments like this, where loyalty, fear, and survival collided. And for the first time since the sirens arrived, doubt crept into the air. Maybe these dogs weren't the problem. Maybe they were proof of one. Margaret remained seated, her hand resting gently on the arm of the chair as memories she had kept buried for years began to surface. The words the officer had spoken, explosions, chaos, breaking from command, had opened a door she rarely allowed herself to touch. "My husband wore a uniform too," she said quietly. The officers outside fell silent. "He was a police officer for over 30 years, Margaret continued, her voice steady but soft. "I watched him leave every morning not knowing if he'd come back. And when he did, sometimes parts of him stayed out there." She glanced down at the dogs. One of them lifted its head slightly, as if listening. "There were nights he woke up shouting," she said. "Loud sounds made him freeze. He'd sit by the door, just like this, watching, protecting." Margaret swallowed. "I learned something living with him," she went on. "Those who serve don't always come home the same. And the ones who suffer the most are usually the ones who stayed loyal until the end." Outside, the senior officer slowly removed his hat. "That's why they trusted you," he said under his breath. Margaret nodded. They didn't see a stranger. They smelled someone who understood. She reached out carefully and rested her hand on the closer dog's back. It didn't pull away. Its muscles eased just a little beneath her touch. "I didn't save them," she said. "I just gave them a place to stop running." The dog stayed perfectly still, accepting the contact like it was familiar, like it had happened before. One of the officers spoke quietly into his radio, his tone no longer sharp. Words like temporary hold and psych evaluation drifted through the cold air. Margaret looked toward the door. "I know you have rules," she said. "I know they belong to you. But if you take them right now, without letting them rest, you'll break something that can't be fixed." Silence followed. Then the senior officer spoke again. "Ma'am, would you be willing to keep them here just for now?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She didn't answer with words. She simply nodded. And in that moment, something shifted. Not just for the dogs, but for everyone watching. The senior officer raised a hand, signaling the others to relax their stance, but no one moved completely away. This was still a risk. Protocol demanded proof. Not sympathy. Not stories. "We need to see how they respond," the officer said carefully. "Controlled interaction. No sudden movements." Margaret nodded, her hands trembling as she stood. The dogs reacted instantly, not alarmed, not aggressive, but attentive. One step closer to her leg, close enough to feel, but not touching. The other remained slightly back, watching the door, watching the officers, watching everything. "Easy," the officer called through the door. "Just do what you were doing before." Margaret took a slow breath and walked toward the kitchen. The dogs followed, but not tightly, not possessively. They moved with space and awareness, stopping when she stopped, adjusting when she turned. Their movements were precise, measured, calm. Outside, officers exchanged looks. "This isn't defensive aggression," one muttered. "This is task focus." Margaret accidentally bumped a chair. The sharp scrape against the floor echoed through the room. Both dogs reacted instantly, one stepping between her and the sound, the other scanning the room. But within seconds, they settled again. No barking, no escalation. The senior officer exhaled slowly. "Call them off," he said. Margaret hesitated. I don't know how." "That's all right," he replied. "Just speak." She swallowed. "It's okay," she said softly. "You're safe." The dogs froze. Then, as if responding to something deeper than a command, they sat, together, perfectly still. A long silence followed. "That settles it," someone whispered outside. The officer stepped back, lowering his radio. "They're not unstable," he said. "They're regulated, focused, still bonded." Margaret felt her knees weaken with relief. Inside, the dogs finally relaxed for the first time since the night before. One lay down fully, head resting on its paws. The other followed, letting out a slow breath that sounded almost like a sigh. The test was over, and the result was clear. These dogs weren't dangerous. They were exhausted, and they had found the only place they trusted enough to stop. The senior officer stood quietly for a long moment, looking through the door as if weighing something far heavier than rules. Around him, the other officers slowly lowered their shoulders. Hands moved away from weapons. Radios went silent. The tension that had wrapped itself around the house since dawn finally began to loosen. "This isn't standard procedure," the officer said at last. "But neither is this situation." Margaret listened, barely breathing. "These dogs have been through extreme stress," he continued. "Removing them right now could make things worse. For them and for everyone." One of the officers frowned. "Sir, are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting," the senior officer interrupted gently, "that we do what's right, not just what's written." He stepped closer to the door. "Ma'am, we're going to file this as a temporary placement. The dogs will remain here under observation. No transport. No separation. At least for now." Margaret's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. "Thank you," she whispered. The dogs seemed to sense the shift immediately. One lifted its head, ears relaxing for the first time. The other shifted closer to the fire, finally allowing its body to rest fully on the floor. Outside, an officer spoke quietly into a radio, updating headquarters. This time, his tone wasn't urgent. It was calm, respectful. "We'll have a behavioral specialist check in," the senior officer added. "But until then, they stay with you." Margaret nodded again, overwhelmed. "I'll take care of them," she said. "I promise." "I believe you," he replied. One by one, the police cars began to pull away. Tires crunched softly over snow. The flashing lights disappeared down the road, leaving behind nothing but quiet and fresh tracks in the white. When the last siren faded, Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, her legs finally giving out. She sank slowly to the floor. The dogs moved to her instantly. Not urgently, not anxiously. They simply came closer and sat beside her, one on each side, steady and warm. For the first time since they arrived, Margaret smiled. She didn't know how long they would stay, but she knew this much. They were safe. And so was she. The house felt different after the police left. Not quieter, just warmer, fuller. Margaret sat by the fireplace as the dogs lay nearby, their bodies finally loose, their breathing slow and deep. The tension that had followed them through the storm, through the night, through the sirens, had begun to fade. For the first time, they slept without taking turns. She watched them in silence, her heart heavy but calm. Later that afternoon, a vet arrived quietly, without lights or uniforms. He examined the dogs carefully, speaking in a low voice, moving slowly. The dogs allowed it. They didn't flinch. They didn't resist. They trusted him, because Margaret trusted him. "They're strong," the vet said. "Tired, but strong. They just need time." Time. That was something Margaret had plenty of. Days passed, then weeks. The dogs healed. Their wounds closed. Their eyes softened. They still stayed alert, still watched the windows, still positioned themselves near doors. But the fear was gone. In its place was purpose. Simple routines. Morning walks. Quiet afternoons. Long evenings by the fire. Neighbors began to wave again. Some stopped to ask questions. Margaret only smiled and said, "They're helping me." And it was true. She talked more now. Laughed sometimes. She slept better. The house no longer echoed with loneliness. One afternoon, the senior officer returned alone. He stood at the doorway, watching as the dogs lay calmly at Margaret's feet. "They won't be returning to service," he said gently. "Officially." Margaret nodded, her hand resting on one dog's head. "They've already served enough." The officer smiled. "We were hoping you'd say that." When he left, Margaret closed the door and stood there for a long moment, letting it sink in. She hadn't just saved 2 dogs from a cold. She had given them a place to rest. And they had given her something back she thought she'd lost forever. That night, as the fire crackled and the snow began to fall again, Margaret whispered softly, "You're home now." The dogs didn't move. They didn't need to. They already knew.